In the harsh wilderness of 1880s Arizona Territory, where survival meant the difference between seeing another sunrise or becoming food for scavengers, most men would have ridden past the unconscious Apache woman lying bloodied beside the dried riverbed. After all, tensions between settlers and native tribes had reached a boiling point, and showing mercy to the enemy could mean signing your own death warrant. But Thomas McKenna wasn't most men. As he knelt beside the barely breathing woman, her dark hair matted with blood and her traditional dress torn to shreds, he made a decision that would challenge everything he thought he knew about honor, humanity, and the true meaning of civilization. What he didn't know was that this moment of compassion would set in motion a chain of events that would transform two broken souls, unite two warring worlds, and prove that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see the humanity in those we've been taught to fear. The morning sun blazed mercilessly across the Arizona desert as Thomas McKenna guided his horse along the rocky trail that wound through the canyon. Sweat dripped from beneath his worn hat, staining the collar of his faded blue shirt. He had been riding since before dawn, searching for strays from his small cattle ranch that bordered the Apache reservation. The year was 1883, and tensions in the territory were higher than they had ever been. Just last month, a wagon train had been attacked 30 miles south, leaving 4 settlers dead and their supplies scattered across the desert floor. Thomas was a practical man, weathered by 3 decades of frontier life. His calloused hands gripped the reins with the confidence of someone who had learned to read the land like other men read newspapers. Every shadow could hide danger, every sound might signal trouble. He had survived the Civil War, Apache raids, drought, and the countless hardships that came with trying to carve out a life in one of the most unforgiving places on earth. But nothing had prepared him for what he would find that September morning. As his horse picked its way carefully down a steep embankment toward what had once been a flowing creek, Thomas spotted something unusual among the scattered rocks and dried brush. At first, he thought it might be a wounded animal, but as he drew closer, his heart began to race. There, lying motionless beside a large boulder, was a young Apache woman. Thomas pulled his rifle from its scabbard and scanned the surrounding area. This could be a trap. Apache warriors were known for their cunning, and using an injured woman as bait was not beyond the realm of possibility. But as he studied the scene more carefully, he realized that whatever had happened here, it had been violent and recent. The woman's clothes were torn and blood-stained. Her long black hair was matted with dried blood, and her face was swollen and bruised beyond recognition. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, though it was difficult to tell given the extent of her injuries. Her breathing was shallow and labored, and Thomas could see that she had been badly beaten. Cuts and bruises covered her arms and legs, and there was dried blood around her mouth and nose. Thomas knelt beside her and gently placed 2 fingers against her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. She was alive, but barely. As he examined her more closely, he could see that she had been wearing traditional Apache dress, beautifully decorated with beadwork and intricate patterns. Now it was ripped and stained, telling a story of violence that made his stomach turn. Looking around the area, Thomas began to piece together what might have happened. There were signs of a struggle, scuffed earth where feet had fought for purchase, and what looked like blood spattered on some of the nearby rocks. But there were no other bodies, no abandoned weapons, no clear indication of who had done this or why. The smart thing would be to ride away. In fact, the safe thing would be to put the woman out of her misery with a quick bullet and continue his search for the missing cattle. Apache and white settlers were at war, and showing mercy to the enemy was often seen as treason by both sides. Thomas had heard stories of white men who had helped Indians being branded as traitors, run out of town, or worse. But as he looked down at the broken woman before him, all he could see was another human being in desperate need of help. Thomas made his decision quickly. He couldn't leave her here to die, not like this. Carefully, he lifted the unconscious woman and carried her to his horse. She was lighter than he had expected, and he could feel how frail she had become from her injuries. Getting her onto the horse was challenging, but Thomas managed to position her in front of him in the saddle, supporting her with one arm while guiding the horse with the other. The ride back to his ranch took nearly 2 hours. Thomas lived alone in a modest cabin he had built himself, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor and 15 miles from the town of Cedar Ridge. It was isolated, which was exactly how he preferred it. Too many people meant too many problems, and Thomas had seen enough problems to last several lifetimes. As they rode, the woman drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes moaning softly, other times so still that Thomas had to check to make sure she was still breathing. He found himself talking to her quietly, not knowing if she could hear him, but hoping somehow that the sound of his voice might comfort her. When they finally reached his property, Thomas carried the woman directly into his cabin and laid her gently on his bed. The single room was spartanly furnished but clean, with a stone fireplace, a small table, and a few shelves holding his meager possessions. He had built everything himself, including the bed frame, from logs he had cut and shaped with his own hands. Thomas lit the oil lamp and examined the woman's injuries more carefully in the better light. What he saw made him angry. Someone had beaten her systematically and brutally. Her ribs were likely broken, judging by the way she breathed. There were deep cuts on her arms and legs that would need cleaning and stitching. Her face was so swollen that her eyes were completely closed, and there was dried blood in her hair from what appeared to be a head wound. He heated water on his wood stove and gathered what medical supplies he had. Thomas had learned basic field medicine during the war, and frontier life had given him plenty of practice patching up injuries. But this was different. This woman needed a doctor, but the nearest physician was in Cedar Ridge, and taking an Apache woman into town would cause more problems than it would solve. As gently as possible, Thomas began cleaning her wounds. He cut away the torn sections of her dress, trying to maintain what modesty he could, while accessing the injuries that needed attention. The woman stirred several times during this process, mumbling words in Apache that Thomas couldn't understand. Once, her eyes fluttered open briefly, and he saw the fear there before she lost consciousness again. Working by lamplight, Thomas spent the next several hours treating her injuries. He stitched the deeper cuts with careful precision, applied salve to the bruises, and bound her ribs as best he could. When he finished, he covered her with his spare blanket and sat back in his chair, exhausted. Looking at the sleeping woman, Thomas wondered what he had gotten himself into. He didn't even know her name or where she had come from. For all he knew, she could be the daughter of a war chief, and helping her might bring the wrath of her entire tribe down on him. On the other hand, she might be an outcast, someone who had already been rejected by her people, and whose disappearance would go unnoticed. But as Thomas sat there in the flickering lamplight, watching over this broken stranger, he realized that none of that mattered. What mattered was that she was alive, and as long as she was under his roof, he would do everything in his power to keep her that way. It was a decision that went against every practical instinct he had developed over 30 years of frontier survival. But it felt right in a way that he couldn't fully explain. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across his property. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonesome sound that seemed to echo the isolation of this place. Thomas pulled his chair closer to the bed and settled in for what he knew would be a long night. Every few minutes, he checked on the woman's breathing and pulse, adjusting her position when necessary and changing the damp cloth he had placed on her forehead. As the hours passed, Thomas found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. He had come west after the war, looking for a place where a man could live quietly and mind his own business. He had chosen this isolated spot specifically because it was far from other people and their problems. Yet here he was, with an unconscious Apache woman in his bed, having made a decision that could easily cost him his life. But Thomas McKenna was not a man who second-guessed himself once a decision was made. He had committed to helping this woman, and he would see it through, regardless of the consequences. As the night wore on and the lamp burned lower, he maintained his vigil, watching over a stranger who had already changed his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. 3 days passed before the Apache woman truly regained consciousness. During those long hours, Thomas barely left her side except to tend to his animals and gather water from the well behind his cabin. He had been through enough medical emergencies to know that the first 72 hours were crucial. Infection could set in, fever could spike, and internal injuries could prove fatal without warning. On the morning of the 4th day, Thomas was changing the bandage on a deep cut across her forearm when her eyes suddenly opened. They were the deepest brown he had ever seen, almost black in the early morning light filtering through his small window. For a moment, neither of them moved. Thomas could see the confusion and fear in her gaze as she tried to make sense of where she was and who this white man hovering over her might be. She tried to sit up quickly, wincing as pain shot through her injured ribs. Thomas gently but firmly pressed her back down onto the bed. "Easy there," he said softly, his voice calm and reassuring. "You're hurt pretty bad. You need to stay still." The woman stared at him with a mixture of wariness and bewilderment. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice hoarse from her ordeal and days of unconsciousness. Thomas shook his head apologetically. "I'm sorry, I don't understand your language. But you're safe here. Nobody's gonna hurt you. Understanding seemed to dawn in her eyes as she took in her surroundings. She was in a white man's cabin, wearing a clean cotton shirt that was clearly not her own, with her injuries carefully bandaged. Her traditional dress was nowhere to be seen, though Thomas had actually cleaned and mended it as best he could and hung it nearby. The woman tried to speak again, this time in halting English. Where am I? Her accent was thick, but her words were clear enough to understand. You're at my ranch, about 15 miles southeast of Cedar Ridge, Thomas replied, pulling his chair closer to the bed. I found you 3 days ago, beaten up pretty bad near Willow Creek. Do you remember what happened? Pain flickered across her features, and not just from her physical injuries. She closed her eyes for a moment, and Thomas could see her struggling to piece together recent events. When she opened them again, there was a hardness there that hadn't been present before. My name is Ayana, she said quietly. It means eternal blossom in my language. She paused, studying Thomas's face carefully. Why did you help me? Why didn't you just leave me there to die? It was a fair question, and one that Thomas had been asking himself repeatedly over the past 3 days. Because leaving someone to die when you can help them isn't right, he answered simply. Doesn't matter who they are or where they come from. Ayana looked skeptical. White men have been killing my people for years. We are at war. You could be hanged as a traitor for helping me. Thomas nodded. That's probably true, but that doesn't change what's right. Over the next several days, as Ayana's strength slowly returned, she began to tell Thomas her story. She had been born into the Chiricahua Apache tribe, daughter of a respected medicine woman. But her life had taken a tragic turn. 2 years earlier, when white soldiers had attacked their village, during what was supposed to be a peaceful negotiation, her mother had been killed in the raid, along with many others, and Ayana had been taken captive. She had spent nearly 18 months in a military prison camp, where conditions were harsh and many of her people died from disease and malnutrition. But Ayana had learned English from a sympathetic chaplain, and her intelligence and determination had helped her survive where others couldn't. 6 months ago, she had managed to escape with 3 other women. They'd been trying to make their way north to join relatives in another tribe when they were discovered by a group of white bounty hunters who made their living tracking down escaped Apache prisoners. The other women had been killed immediately, but the bounty hunters had other plans for Ayana. They kept me for weeks, she said quietly one evening as Thomas prepared her dinner. Her voice was steady, but Thomas could see the pain in her eyes. They used me badly, then decided I was too much trouble to keep alive. They beat me and left me where you found me, thinking the desert would finish what they started. Thomas felt a cold anger rising in his chest. He had seen enough violence and cruelty during the war to last several lifetimes, but there was something particularly revolting about men who would torture and abuse a helpless woman. Did you know these men? Could you identify them? Ayana shook her head. They were not from around here. They spoke of moving on to California once they finished their business in Arizona. They're probably long gone by now. As the days passed, Thomas found himself looking forward to their conversations more than he cared to admit. Ayana was intelligent and well-spoken, with a dry sense of humor that occasionally broke through her wariness. She told him stories about her childhood, about Apache traditions and beliefs, and about the way her people had lived before the white man's wars changed everything. In return, Thomas shared his own story. He had grown up on a farm in Missouri, the youngest of 5 sons. When the Civil War began, 3 of his brothers had joined the Union Army. 2 had never come home. Thomas himself had enlisted at 17, lying about his age to get into a Missouri regiment. He had fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the war, including Gettysburg and Antietam. After the war ended, I couldn't go back to farming, he explained one afternoon as he helped Ayana walk slowly around the cabin to rebuild her strength. I'd seen too much, lost too much. So I came west looking for a place where a man could live quietly and maybe find some peace. And did you find it? Ayana asked. Thomas considered the question carefully. I thought I had. This place, this isolation, it seemed like exactly what I needed. But now, he gestured around the cabin, where Ayana's presence had somehow made the space feel less empty and more like an actual home. I'm not so sure anymore. As Ayana's physical condition improved, she began to help with small tasks around the cabin. Despite Thomas's protests that she should rest, she insisted on contributing in whatever way she could. She proved to be an excellent cook, able to create flavorful meals from the simple ingredients in Thomas's pantry. She also had extensive knowledge of medicinal plants and showed him several herbs growing wild on his property that could be used to treat various ailments. But perhaps most importantly, her presence brought a warmth to the cabin that Thomas hadn't realized was missing. For years, he had lived alone with only his thoughts for company. Now, there was conversation and laughter. Someone to share meals with, someone who cared whether he returned safely from his daily rides around the property. One evening, about 2 weeks after Ayana had first awakened, they were sitting by the fireplace sharing a dinner of rabbit stew and cornbread, when she asked the question Thomas had been dreading. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I am strong enough to travel now. I should go. Every day I stay here puts you in more danger." Thomas set down his fork and looked across the table at her. In the firelight, with her bruises faded and her hair clean and braided, she was beautiful in a way that took his breath away. But more than that, she had become his friend, his companion, someone whose absence would leave a hole in his life that he wasn't sure could ever be filled. "Where would you go?" he asked. Ayana was quiet for a long moment. "I have a cousin among the Mescalero Apache in New Mexico territory. If I could reach them, they might take me in. But it's a dangerous journey, especially for a woman traveling alone." "Then don't travel alone," Thomas said suddenly. The words were out of his mouth before he had fully thought them through. But once spoken, he realized he meant them completely. Ayana stared at him in surprise. "You would come with me? You would give up your home, your life here, to help me reach my people?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering the magnitude of what he was suggesting. Leaving his ranch meant abandoning everything he had built over the past 5 years. It meant riding into hostile territory where there would be targets for both Apache warriors who might not trust a white man and white settlers who would see him as a traitor. It was dangerous, probably foolish, and almost certainly a one-way journey. But as he looked at Ayana across the table, Thomas realized that the alternative, watching her ride away into an uncertain and dangerous future alone, was unthinkable. "Yes," he said simply. "I would." Tears gathered in Ayana's eyes, and for the first time since he had found her, she smiled a genuine, radiant smile that seemed to light up the entire cabin. "You are a good man, Thomas McKenna," she said softly. "But I cannot ask you to sacrifice everything for me." "You're not asking," Thomas replied. "I'm choosing, and I've made my choice." That night, as they made plans for their journey, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not just for Ayana's safety, but for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he might have found something worth living for beyond mere survival. The morning they left Thomas's ranch dawned clear and cold, with frost coating the sagebrush and a sharp wind blowing down from the mountains to the north. Thomas had spent the previous week preparing for their journey, gathering supplies, studying maps, and trying to plot the safest route to the Mescalero Apache territory in New Mexico. It was nearly 300 miles of some of the most dangerous country in the Southwest, but they both knew that staying put was no longer an option. Word was spreading through the territory about an Apache woman being sheltered by a white rancher. Thomas had learned this 3 days earlier when his neighbor, Ben Crawford, had ridden over ostensibly to borrow some tools, but really to ask pointed questions about whether Thomas had seen any Indians in the area lately. The conversation had been polite but tense, and Thomas could see the suspicion in the other man's eyes. "You be careful out here, Tom," Crawford had said as he prepared to leave. "There's been talk in town about Apache raiders getting bolder. Some folks are saying it might be time to organize another militia sweep of the area." Thomas had thanked him for the warning, but both men knew exactly what was really being discussed. It wouldn't be long before a group of armed settlers decided to pay Thomas a visit, and when they did, they wouldn't be interested in explanations or nuances. Now, as Thomas loaded their supplies onto 2 horses and secured his rifle in its saddle scabbard, he tried not to think about the fact that he was likely seeing his home for the last time. He had built this place with his own hands, had planned to live out his days here in peaceful solitude. But life, he reflected, rarely went according to plan. Ayana emerged from the cabin wearing her traditional Apache dress, which Thomas had managed to repair reasonably well. Over it, she wore a heavy coat that Thomas had bought for her during a supply trip to town. Her long black hair was braided and tucked beneath a hat that would help disguise her identity from a distance. In her hand, she carried a small bundle containing a few personal items and some of the medicinal herbs she had gathered from around the property. "Are you ready?" Thomas asked as he helped her mount her horse. Ayana nodded, though Thomas could see the apprehension in her eyes. This journey would be dangerous for both of them, but for her, it represented a chance to return to her people and reclaim some portion of the life that had been stolen from her. For Thomas, it was a leap into an uncertain future that he was taking purely on faith. They rode south initially, following cattle trails through the desert scrub and staying well away from established roads where they might encounter other travelers. Thomas had decided that their best hope lay in reaching the Rio Grande and following it southeast into New Mexico territory. It would add distance to their journey, but the river would provide water, and the route would take them through less populated areas. The first 2 days passed without incident. They traveled during the cooler morning and evening hours, resting during the hottest part of the day beneath whatever shade they could find. The desert landscape was harsh but beautiful, with towering saguaro cacti standing like ancient sentinels, and distant mountains painted purple and gold by the setting sun. As they rode, Thomas found himself learning more about Ayana's people and their ways. She taught him some basic Apache words and phrases, explaining the spiritual significance of various landmarks they passed. In return, he shared his knowledge of frontier survival, showing her how to read weather signs and identify edible plants that might not be familiar to someone from a different region. On their third day out, they encountered their first real danger. They were watering their horses at a small spring when Ayana suddenly froze, her head cocked as if listening to something Thomas couldn't hear. A moment later, she grabbed his arm and pulled him behind a large boulder. "Riders coming," she whispered, "from the north." Thomas strained his ears and finally caught the sound of hoofbeats on rock. Moving carefully, he peered around the boulder and counted 5 men on horseback approaching the spring. Even from a distance, he could see that they were armed and riding hard, as if pursuing something, or someone. The men reached the spring and dismounted, letting their horses drink while they scanned the surrounding area. Thomas recognized the type immediately: hard men with sun-weathered faces, and an air of casual violence that came from lives spent taking what they wanted by force. These were likely bounty hunters, men who made their living tracking down escaped Apache prisoners for the bounty money offered by the territorial government. "Fresh tracks," one of them called out, kneeling beside the water. "2 horses shod, been here within the hour." "Could be our boy and his Apache squaw," another replied. Crawford said they headed south from his place. Thomas felt Ayana tense beside him at the crude reference, but she remained silent. They crouched behind the boulder for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, listening to the men discuss their plans and trying to figure out which direction their quarry had gone. Finally, the bounty hunters mounted up and rode west, apparently deciding that Thomas and Ayana had headed toward the mountains. As soon as they were out of sight, Thomas and Ayana quickly gathered their things and resumed their journey, pushing their horses harder than they had planned and not stopping until well after dark. That night, as they camped in a dry wash with no fire and only jerky and water for dinner, the reality of their situation became clear. They were being hunted by men who would kill Thomas and do worse to Ayana if they were caught. The territorial authorities would likely offer a reward for their capture, and every settler, drifter, and opportunist in Arizona would be looking for them. "I'm sorry," Ayana said quietly, as they lay in their bedrolls beneath a canopy of brilliant stars. "I've brought this danger into your life. You could still turn back, tell people I forced you to help me at gunpoint. They might believe you." Thomas was quiet for a moment, listening to the distant howl of coyotes and the wind rustling through the sparse vegetation. "Ayana," he said finally, "do you know what I was doing for the 5 years before I found you?" "Living alone on your ranch," she replied. "Existing," Thomas corrected. "Just going through the motions of being alive without any real purpose or meaning. These past few weeks, traveling with you, having someone to talk to, having a reason to get up in the morning beyond just basic survival, I felt more alive than I have since before the war. Whatever happens now, I'm grateful for that." The next morning brought new challenges. They were crossing a particularly exposed stretch of desert when they spotted a dust cloud on the horizon behind them. Someone was following their trail and moving fast. Thomas urged their horses into a gallop, racing for a line of hills that might provide cover, but he could see that they weren't going to make it in time. There, Ayana pointed toward a cluster of large boulders and desert ironwood trees about half a mile to their left. "We can make a stand there if we have to." They reached the rocks just as their pursuers came into view. It was the same group of bounty hunters from the spring, plus 2 additional men. Thomas counted 7 riders total, all armed and clearly determined to run them down. As the men approached, Thomas checked his rifle and revolver, knowing that if it came to a fight, he and Ayana would be badly outnumbered. "Thomas McKenna," one of the bounty hunters called out as they reined in about 50 yards away. "We know you're in there. Come on out peaceful-like, and we'll make this easy on everyone." "What do you want?" Thomas called back, though he already knew the answer. "We want the Apache woman you're harboring. There's a $500 bounty on her head, dead or alive. Hand her over, and you can ride away from this. Thomas looked at Ayana, who had positioned herself behind a boulder with his spare revolver in her hand. Her face was calm, but he could see the determination in her eyes. She had already been captured once and subjected to months of brutal treatment. She would not be taken alive again. She's under my protection, Thomas called back. Anyone who wants her will have to go through me first. The bounty hunters exchanged glances, clearly not having expected this level of resistance from one man. Don't be a fool, McKenna, their leader shouted. She's just an Indian. No Apache squaw is worth dying for. Maybe not to you, Thomas replied, but that's where we differ. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted nearly 2 hours. The bounty hunters tried various approaches, alternately threatening and cajoling. But Thomas refused to budge. Finally, apparently deciding that the situation wasn't worth the risk of a prolonged gun battle, they rode away toward the east. But Thomas knew they hadn't given up. They would likely circle around and try to pick up the trail again, or perhaps return with reinforcements. He and Ayana needed to find a way to throw them off permanently, and they needed to do it soon. As if reading his thoughts, Ayana spoke up. There's an old Apache trick my father taught me, she said thoughtfully. It might work, but it would mean splitting up for a while. Absolutely not, Thomas replied immediately. We stay together. Listen to me, Ayana insisted. I'll take one of the horses and ride east, leaving an obvious trail. You take the other horse and our supplies and continue south. I know this country better than those men do. I can lose them in the mountains and then circle back to meet you at the Rio Grande. It's too dangerous. If they catch you, they won't catch me, Ayana said with quiet confidence. I've been running from white men my whole life. I know how to disappear when I need to. Thomas wanted to refuse, every instinct telling him not to let her out of his sight. But he could see the logic in her plan, and he knew that their chances of outrunning 7 mounted men across open desert was slim to none. Reluctantly, he agreed to the plan. They would separate here, with Ayana leading the bounty hunters away while Thomas continued toward their destination. They would meet again in 5 days at a specific landmark along the Rio Grande that Ayana had described. As they prepared to part ways, Thomas felt a fear unlike anything he had experienced since the war. Not fear for his own safety, but terror at the thought of something happening to this remarkable woman who had somehow become the center of his world in such a short time. Promise me you'll be careful, he said, as he helped her mount her horse. Ayana leaned down and placed her hand against his cheek. Promise me you won't wait forever if something goes wrong. If I don't reach the meeting place in 7 days, continue to my people and tell them what happened. Thomas caught her hand and held it for a moment. You'll be there, he said firmly. I know you will. And then she was gone, riding east across the desert with the kind of easy grace that spoke of a lifetime spent in the saddle. Thomas watched until she disappeared behind a distant ridge, then turned his own horse south toward the Rio Grande. And 5 days, that would feel like the longest of his life. The 5 days that followed their separation were the longest and most agonizing of Thomas's life. He rode south through increasingly desolate country, following dry creek beds and animal trails, constantly looking over his shoulder for signs of pursuit. But the bounty hunters had apparently taken Ayana's bait and followed her east into the mountains, giving Thomas a clear path to their rendezvous point along the Rio Grande. Without Ayana's company, the journey felt different. The landscape seemed harsher, more threatening. The silence that he had once treasured now felt oppressive and lonely. Thomas found himself talking to his horse just to hear a voice, even his own. He had grown accustomed to Ayana's presence in ways he was only beginning to understand, and her absence left him feeling incomplete. On the 3rd day, he encountered a group of Mexican traders heading north with a wagon full of goods. They were friendly enough, sharing their fire and offering him a meal of beans and tortillas in exchange for news from the north. But Thomas was careful not to mention anything about his traveling companion or his destination. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. You travel alone, senor? Asked the leader of the group, an older man named Carlos with silver hair and knowing eyes. This is dangerous country for one man by himself. I'm used to being alone, Thomas replied. Though even as he said it, he realized it was no longer entirely true. Carlos studied him thoughtfully. A man who travels alone by choice is different from one who travels alone because he has no choice. You, I think, have made a choice recently that has changed you. The observation was uncomfortably accurate, but Thomas simply nodded and changed the subject. Still, the old trader's words stayed with him as he continued south the next morning. Had he changed? And if so, how? The answer came to him as he rode through a particularly beautiful stretch of desert dotted with blooming barrel cacti and framed by distant purple mountains. Before finding Ayana, he had been a man running from his past, seeking isolation and solitude as an escape from painful memories. Now, for the first time in years, he was running towards something instead of away from it. He had a purpose beyond mere survival, a reason to hope for the future. On the fourth day, Thomas reached the Rio Grande and began following it southeast toward their agreed-upon meeting place. The river was low this time of year, more of a creek in many places, but it provided water for his horse and a reliable landmark to follow. The country here was different from the high desert around his ranch, more green and lush, with cottonwood trees lining the riverbank and good grass for grazing. As he rode, Thomas found himself thinking about what would happen after they reached the Mescalero Apache territory. Assuming Ayana's people accepted them, what then? He had given up everything he owned to make this journey, burning his bridges as thoroughly as if he had set fire to his ranch himself. There would be no going back to his old life, even if he wanted to. But the strange thing was, he didn't want to go back. The solitary existence that had once seemed like paradise now felt like a prison. Whatever lay ahead, he wanted to face it with Ayana at his side. The meeting place they had agreed upon was a distinctive rock formation that jutted out into the river like a stone finger. Ayana had called it Eagle's Perch, explaining that her people had used it as a landmark for generations. Thomas arrived there on the morning of the fifth day and made camp in a grove of cottonwoods where he could watch the approaches from all directions. The first day passed without sign of Ayana. Thomas tried not to worry, telling himself that she might have encountered delays or been forced to take a longer route to avoid pursuit. But as the sun set on the sixth day with still no sign of her, his anxiety began to transform into something approaching panic. On the seventh day, Thomas climbed to the top of the rock formation and spent hours scanning the northern horizon through his spyglass, looking for any sign of movement. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, empty and silent under the merciless sun. By evening, he was forced to confront the possibility that something had gone wrong. That night, as he sat by his small campfire, Thomas tried to decide what to do. Ayana had made him promise to continue to her people if she didn't arrive, but the thought of arriving at the Mescalero camp with news of her disappearance was almost unbearable. How could he tell her cousin that he had let her ride off alone to face unknown dangers? On the eighth day, just as Thomas was preparing to break camp and continue south, he saw a dust cloud approaching from the northwest. His heart leaped with hope, but as the rider drew closer, he could see that it was a single horse with what appeared to be a man in the saddle. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle. The rider turned out to be a young Apache warrior, perhaps 20 years old, mounted on a paint horse and armed with both a rifle and traditional weapons. He approached Thomas's camp cautiously, but without apparent hostility, raising one hand in what Thomas took to be a greeting. "You are the white man called McKenna?" the warrior asked in accented but clear English. "I am," Thomas replied, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" "I am called Swift Arrow. I bring word from the woman Ayana." Thomas felt a mixture of relief and terror. Ayana was alive, but the fact that she had sent a messenger instead of coming herself suggested that something was very wrong. "Where is she?" Thomas demanded. "Is she hurt?" Swift Arrow dismounted and accepted Thomas's offer to share his fire. 3 days ago, Ayana came to our camp in the mountains, he began. She had been pursued by white bounty hunters but had lost them in the canyons. She was unharmed but exhausted. "Then why didn't she come here herself?" The young warrior's expression grew somber. "Because word has reached our camp that a large force of soldiers and militia is moving through this area, hunting for escaped Apache and the white man who helps them. The bounty on Ayana's head has been increased to $1,000, and there is now a $500 reward for your capture as well." Thomas felt his stomach clench. The situation was even worse than he had feared. "Ayana sends word that it is too dangerous for her to travel to you now," Swift Arrow continued. "But she has asked me to guide you to our camp, if you are willing to come. It is a hard journey through rough country, but we can protect you there." Thomas didn't hesitate. "When do we leave?" "Now, if you are ready. We must travel only at night and hide during the day. The soldiers have Apache scouts with them who can read signs, so we must be very careful." As they prepared to leave, Swift Arrow shared more details about the situation. Apparently, Thomas and Ayana's flight had sparked a territory-wide manhunt. Stories had spread and grown in the telling until they had become a symbol of everything that white settlers feared about Apache uprising and white betrayal. The territorial governor had personally authorized the increased bounties and had dispatched federal troops to assist in the search. "Why are your people willing to help me?" Thomas asked as they loaded his supplies onto the pack horse. "I'm a white man. Your people have every reason to hate me." Swift Arrow looked at him thoughtfully. "Ayana has told us your story," he said, "about how you found her and cared for her, about the choice you made to help her even when it cost you everything. My cousin believes you are a man of honor, and she does not give her trust lightly." "Your cousin?" "Ayana is the daughter of my father's sister," Swift Arrow explained. "Her mother was a powerful medicine woman among our people. Ayana carries her mother's gift for seeing into people's hearts." The journey to the Apache camp took 3 nights of hard traveling, through some of the most difficult terrain Thomas had ever encountered. They moved through narrow canyons and across knife-edge ridges, following paths that seemed to exist only in Swift Arrow's memory. During the day, they hid in caves or beneath rock overhangs, sleeping fitfully and speaking only in whispers. On the second night, they had a close call when a cavalry patrol passed within a few hundred yards of their position. Thomas lay flat against the rocky ground, hardly daring to breathe as the soldiers rode by below them. Their horses' hooves rang against the stone, and Thomas could hear the soldiers talking quietly among themselves about the search for the Apache woman and her white accomplice. $10,000 total reward money, one of them was saying. "That's enough to set a man up for life." "If we could find them," another replied. "But they could be anywhere by now. Mexico, California, who knows?" Thomas felt a grim satisfaction at knowing that the authorities had no idea where they actually were. But he also realized that the huge bounty would ensure that every opportunist and fortune hunter in the Southwest would be looking for them. On the third night, as they climbed higher into the mountains, the terrain became even more challenging. Swift Arrow led them along paths that seemed to defy gravity, winding around sheer cliff faces and crossing streams on fallen logs that served as natural bridges. Thomas's horse struggled with the altitude in the thin air, and more than once he had to dismount and lead the animal by hand across particularly treacherous sections. Just before dawn, they crested a ridge, and Thomas saw their destination spread out in a hidden valley below. The Apache camp was larger than he had expected, with perhaps 50 or 60 people living in traditional wickiups scattered among the cottonwood trees along the stream. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and Thomas could see women preparing the morning meal while children played nearby. And there, standing beside a fire near the center of the camp, was Ayana. Even from a distance, Thomas could see that she was unharmed and apparently well. She wore traditional Apache clothing and had her hair braided in a different style than he was used to, making her look more like the Apache woman she was and less like the injured refugee he had rescued. But when she looked up and saw him approaching, her face lit up with a smile that made the 3 days of hard travel worthwhile. As they rode into the camp, Thomas was acutely aware of the attention they were receiving. Every person in the village had stopped what they were doing to stare at the white man who had chosen to cast his lot with their people. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion, and a few displayed outright hostility. But when Ayana ran forward to greet him, throwing her arms around him in a gesture that spoke of relief and joy, Thomas realized that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And for the first time since leaving his ranch, he felt like he might actually be home. The Apache camp was a world unto itself, hidden in a valley so remote that Thomas doubted it appeared on any white man's map. Steep canyon walls provided natural fortification, while a year-round stream ensured fresh water, and the cottonwood groves offered shelter from both the elements and prying eyes. It was, Thomas realized, the perfect place for a people who had been forced to live as refugees in their own homeland. The integration into Apache society was not immediate or easy for Thomas. Despite Ayana's obvious affection for him and Swift Arrow's sponsorship, many of the tribal members remained suspicious of his presence. He was, after all, a white man in a camp of people who had suffered terribly at the hands of white soldiers and settlers. Trust would have to be earned, not simply given. The camp's leader was an older man named Nalnesh, whose name meant "he works" in Apache. He was Ayana's uncle, her mother's older brother, and a man whose weathered face spoke of decades of struggle and survival. When Thomas was formally presented to him on his second day in the camp, Nalnesh studied him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "My niece tells me you saved her life," Nalnesh said in carefully pronounced English. "She also tells me you gave up everything you owned to help her reach our people. This shows either great wisdom or great foolishness. I have not yet decided which." "I'm not sure I know the difference anymore," Thomas replied honestly. Nalnesh smiled slightly at this response. That may be the beginning of wisdom after all, he said. We will see. The test came sooner than Thomas expected. On his fourth day in the camp, scouts brought word that a large force of cavalry and civilian militia was approaching the general area, apparently following intelligence that Apache refugees were hiding somewhere in the mountains. The entire camp would need to relocate immediately to avoid discovery. Thomas watched in amazement as the Apache community transformed itself from a settled village into a mobile unit in less than 2 hours. Wiki-ups were dismantled with practiced efficiency, possessions were packed onto horses and travoisa, and within moments what had been a thriving community became an empty valley with few traces that anyone had ever lived there. The relocation took them even deeper into the mountains, following paths that Thomas would never have believed passable for horses, much less for families with small children and elderly members. But the Apache had been nomadic people for generations, and they moved through the rugged terrain with an ease that spoke of deep knowledge and long practice. During the 3-day journey to the new camp location, Thomas began to earn his place among Ayana's people. His skills with horses proved valuable, as did his knowledge of frontier survival and his willingness to take on whatever tasks needed doing without complaint. But perhaps most importantly, he showed that he could endure hardship without losing his determination or his sense of humor. The new camp was established in an even more remote location, a box canyon accessible only through a narrow defile that could easily be defended by a few warriors. Here, Thomas began to learn Apache ways in earnest. Ayana served as his primary teacher, patiently explaining customs and traditions that were as foreign to him as his own culture had once been to her. He learned that the Apache people had a complex relationship with the natural world, seeing themselves as part of an interconnected web of life rather than as masters of nature. He learned about their spiritual beliefs, their social structure, and their oral traditions that kept alive the history and wisdom of countless generations. In return, Thomas shared his own knowledge and skills. His ability to read and write proved valuable for interpreting documents that occasionally fell into Apache hands, providing intelligence about military movements and government policies. His medical knowledge, learned during the war and refined through frontier necessity, was welcomed by the camp's medicine people, who were always interested in new ways to heal injuries and treat illnesses. But perhaps most importantly, Thomas began to learn the Apache language. It was difficult and complex, with subtle tonal variations that changed meaning entirely, but Ayanana was a patient teacher and Thomas was a motivated student. As his vocabulary grew, so did his acceptance within the community. Language, he discovered, was more than just a means of communication. It was a doorway into an entirely different way of thinking about the world. The changing seasons brought new challenges and new opportunities for Thomas to prove himself. When winter arrived, he joined hunting parties that ventured out into the snow-covered mountains in search of deer and elk. His marksmanship was excellent, but he had to learn entirely new techniques for moving silently through the forest and reading the subtle signs that indicated the presence of game. During one particularly memorable hunt, Thomas was separated from the main party during a sudden blizzard. For 2 days, he survived alone in the wilderness, using skills that were part frontier knowledge and part newly learned Apache techniques. When he finally made his way back to camp, carrying the deer he had managed to kill during his ordeal, even some of his harshest critics began to acknowledge that he might actually belong among them. As winter gave way to spring, Thomas's relationship with Ayana deepened and evolved. What had begun as mutual dependence and shared danger had grown into something much more profound. They spent long evening hours talking by the fire, sharing stories of their past lives and dreams for their future. Thomas told her about his childhood in Missouri, about the farm where he had grown up, and the family he had lost to war and distance. Ayana shared memories of her mother, the medicine woman whose wisdom and strength had shaped her understanding of the world. My mother always said that the Creator sometimes brings people together from very different paths, for reasons that may not be immediately clear, Ayana told him one evening as they walked along the stream that ran through their canyon home. She believed that when such meetings happen, it means both people have something important to learn from each other. What do you think I'm supposed to learn from you? Thomas asked. Ayana was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Maybe that there are different ways to be strong, she said finally. You white people often think that strength means controlling everything around you, bending the world to your will. But my people believe that real strength comes from finding your place within the world, from understanding how you fit into the great pattern of life. And what are you learning from me? That some white people can change, Ayana replied with a smile. That not all of you are trapped by the fears and prejudices that have caused so much pain between our peoples. Their relationship was watched closely by the entire camp, Thomas knew. An Apache woman and a white man forming a romantic attachment was unprecedented in most people's experience, and opinions were divided about whether such a union could work. Some saw it as a hopeful sign that peace between the two cultures might someday be possible. Others worried that it would bring unwanted attention from the outside world and endanger the entire community. The debate came to a head in late spring, when scouts reported that bounty hunters were once again active in the area, apparently having received new intelligence about the location of Apache refugees. During the council meeting that followed this news, several tribal members argued that Thomas's presence in the camp made them all targets, and that he should be asked to leave for everyone's safety. Nalish listened to all viewpoints before speaking. It is true that this man's presence brings danger, he acknowledged. But it is also true that he has proven his loyalty and his worth to our people. The question we must ask ourselves is not whether keeping him among us involves risk, but whether that risk is outweighed by the benefits of having him as one of us. The discussion continued for hours, with passionate arguments on both sides. In the end, it was Ayana who settled the matter. Standing before the assembled council, she spoke with quiet dignity about the man who had saved her life and chosen to share her fate. Thomas McKenna could have left me to die in the desert, she said. Instead, he risked everything to help a woman he barely knew. When bounty hunters came for us, he could have bought his safety by turning me over to them. Instead, he chose to fight for my life. When we separated on our journey here, he could have simply ridden away to safety. Instead, he came here to be with my people, knowing that it might mean he could never return to his old life. This is not the behavior of someone who thinks only of himself. This is the behavior of someone who understands what it means to be part of a family, part of a tribe. When the vote was taken, the decision was unanimous. Thomas would stay, and he would be formally adopted into the tribe as Ayana's husband, if that was what they both desired. The wedding ceremony took place on a warm evening in early summer, with the entire camp gathered around a large fire built specifically for the occasion. It was unlike any wedding Thomas had ever imagined, blending Apache traditions with improvised elements that acknowledged his white heritage. Nalnish officiated, speaking in Apache, while Swift Arrow translated for Thomas's benefit. The ceremony included the sharing of corn pollen, a symbol of fertility and new beginnings, and the exchange of gifts that represented the joining of their separate paths into one shared journey. Thomas gave Ayana a silver locket that had belonged to his mother, the one possession he had carried with him from his old life. Ayana gave Thomas a medicine bag containing herbs and stones that would protect him and connect him to the spiritual traditions of her people. But perhaps the most meaningful part of the ceremony was when Nalnish spoke directly to both of them about the responsibilities they were undertaking. Marriage is not just the joining of two people, he said. It is the creation of a bridge between different worlds. You, Ayana, will help this man understand our ways and find his place among us. You, Thomas, will help us understand that not all white people are our enemies, that it is possible to live in peace with those who are different from us. As summer progressed, Thomas settled fully into his new life as an Apache husband and tribal member. He and Ayana built their own wiki up near the center of the camp, and Thomas took on increased responsibilities within the community. He helped train younger men in marksmanship and military tactics, skills that might prove crucial if soldiers ever found their hidden valley. He also worked with the tribal council to develop plans for evacuating the camp quickly if they were ever discovered. But it was in his role as Ayana's husband that Thomas found his greatest happiness. They worked together, hunted together, and spent long hours talking about their dreams for the future. Ayana's belly began to swell with their first child, a development that brought joy to the entire camp and seemed to symbolize hope for the future. One evening in late autumn, as they sat by their fire watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Ayana placed Thomas's hand on her rounded stomach so he could feel their baby moving inside her. "What do you think about when you feel that?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the life change that was coming. "I think about how this child will grow up knowing both worlds," he said finally. "Apache and white, understanding both cultures but belonging fully to neither one. Or belonging fully to both," Ayana suggested gently. "Our child will be the bridge between our peoples that Nalnish talked about at our wedding." Thomas nodded, though he couldn't help but worry about the challenges their child would face. The world outside their hidden valley was not ready for Apache white children, and it might not be for generations to come. But as he sat there with his wife beside him and his unborn child moving beneath his hand, Thomas realized that he had found something worth all the risks they had taken. He had found love, purpose, and a place where he truly belonged. Whatever the future held, he would face it as part of this community, this family, this new life that had begun the day he chose not to ride past a dying woman in the desert. The bounty hunters were still out there somewhere, and the territorial authorities would never stop looking for them. The conflicts between Apache people and white settlers would continue, and the path to lasting peace remained unclear. But in this hidden valley, with these people who had accepted him as one of their own, Thomas McKenna had found something that had eluded him for most of his adult life. He had found home.